Dutch Schultz sent his best killer to murder Bumpy Johnson. 48 hours later, the killer was drinking whiskey with the man he came to kill. This is the story of how one photograph destroyed the most powerful gangster in New York and proved that in Harlem, you don't hunt Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson hunts you. The Bowery, Manhattan. January 14th, 1936. 11:47 p.m. Dutch Schultz sat alone in the back room of his headquarters, staring at a photograph of Bumpy Johnson, like it was a death warrant he was signing for himself. 3 months had passed since Johnson killed 8 of his men in 7 days. 3 months have passed since Schultz's Harlem operation collapsed. 3 months since other gangsters started whispering that Dutch Schultz, the man who'd never backed down from anyone, had been beaten by a colored gangster from uptown. The whispering was killing him. Not literally, not yet, but killing his reputation, killing his authority, killing the fear that made people obey him without question. Lucky Luciano was laughing at him. Meyer Lansky was avoiding his calls. Frank Costello told him to his face that losing to Johnson made Schultz look weak, made him look like yesterday's gangster, made him look finished. Schultz couldn't sleep anymore, couldn't eat without his stomach twisting, couldn't walk into rooms without sensing that people were judging him, questioning whether he was still the Dutch Schultz who'd built a $20 million bootlegging empire, or whether Johnson had broken something inside him that couldn't be fixed. And the worst part, the part that made Schultz want to put his fist through walls, was that Johnson hadn't even killed him. Johnson could have. During those 7 days when Schultz's men were dying one by one, when Schultz was tearing Harlem apart trying to find Johnson and failing, Johnson could have sent someone to kill Schultz himself. Could have ended it. Could have become the man who killed Dutch Schultz and taken that reputation into legend. But Johnson didn't kill him. Johnson did something worse. Johnson let him live. Let him survive with the knowledge that he'd been beaten, been outsmarted, and been humiliated in front of the entire New York underworld. And that, Schultz understood with crystal clarity, was a calculated insult. Johnson was saying that Schultz wasn't even worth killing, that destroying his Harlem operation and his reputation was punishment enough. That Dutch Schultz could live with his shame because a dead Schultz would become a martyr. But a living Schultz who'd lost to a black gangster would become a joke. Schultz had spent 3 months trying to rebuild, trying to salvage his reputation through other operations, trying to prove he was still relevant. But nothing worked. The whispers continued. The disrespect grew, and Schultz realized that the only way to fix this, the only way to restore his reputation and his authority, was to do what he should have done 3 months ago. Kill Bumpy Johnson. Not through a public confrontation, not through a gang war that Johnson had already proven he could win, but through a professional hit. A clean assassination that would happen so fast, Johnson wouldn't see it coming. 1 bullet. 1 body. One message to the entire underworld that Dutch Schultz doesn't lose, doesn't accept defeat, doesn't let anyone, colored or white, beat him and live to brag about it. Schultz picked up the telephone on his desk at exactly midnight, made a long-distance call to Chicago, asked for Mickey Corrigan. Mickey the Iceman. Corrigan was 34 years old and had killed 23 people for money. He wasn't the biggest contract killer, wasn't the most famous, but he was the most reliable. Corrigan didn't miss, didn't get caught, didn't leave witnesses or evidence or any trace that he'd been there except the body and the bullet. He'd killed for the Chicago outfit, for independent operators, for businessmen who needed competitors removed, for politicians who needed scandals buried. He killed Italians and Irish and Jews and Poles. He'd never killed a Negro, but that didn't bother him. A target was a target. A contract was a contract. Money was money. Corrigan worked from a simple principle. Everyone dies eventually. He was just speeding up the process for people unlucky enough to make enemies with enough money to afford his services. The phone rang in Corrigan's Chicago apartment at 12:14 a.m. He answered on the second ring because calls after midnight were always business, and business was always interesting. Schultz didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need someone dead. New York, 2 weeks maximum, $10,000, 5 now, 5 when it's done." Corrigan lit a cigarette and smiled. $10,000 was serious money, enough to live comfortably for 2 years, enough to make the risk worthwhile even if the target was difficult. "Who's the target?" Corrigan asked. "She, Bumpy Johnson, colored gangster, operates in Harlem. I'll provide photographs, addresses, known associates, everything you need." Corrigan had heard of Johnson, had read about the 7-day war in the newspapers, about how Johnson killed 8 of Schultz's men and drove Schultz out of Harlem. That made Johnson dangerous, but it also made him arrogant. Dangerous and arrogant were a perfect combination for getting killed because dangerous men made enemies, and arrogant men stopped being careful. "I'll take the contract," Corrigan said. "Wire the money tonight. I'll be in New York tomorrow." Schultz wired $5,000 to Corrigan's account at 1 a.m. By 6 a.m., Corrigan was on a train heading east toward New York, carrying 2 suitcases. One held clothes and toiletries. The other held a disassembled sniper rifle, 3 handguns, a knife, and enough ammunition to kill a dozen people if the Johnson hit got complicated. The train rolled through the Pennsylvania countryside while Corrigan studied the file Schultz had prepared. Photographs of Johnson, recent ones, clear images that showed his face, his build, his style of dress. Johnson was tall, well-dressed, always wore expensive suits and hats, always looked calm and controlled, even in candid photos where he didn't know he was being photographed. The file included addresses: Johnson's apartment on West 139th Street, 3 policy banks he owned, 2 restaurants where he ate regularly, a barbershop he visited every Saturday morning, a nightclub he frequented on Friday nights. Schultz had done thorough reconnaissance, had tracked Johnson's movements for weeks, had built a complete picture of his routine and his vulnerabilities. Corrigan read through everything twice, memorizing details, looking for patterns, identifying the moment when Johnson would be most exposed. The barbershop was promising. Public location, but Johnson would be sitting still for 45 minutes, predictable timing, easy approach, and escape routes. Corrigan circled that option in red. Preliminary plan: Saturday morning hit. Walk in, shoot Johnson in the chair, walk out. 30 seconds total. Gone before anyone understood what happened. The train arrived at Penn Station at 4:37 p.m. on Tuesday. Corrigan took a cab to a modest hotel on the edge of Harlem, registered under a fake name, paid cash for a week in advance, and carried his suitcases up to a 3rd-floor room overlooking the street. He unpacked carefully, assembling the rifle and checking the handguns, making sure everything survived the journey without damage. Everything was perfect. Corrigan stood at the window, looking out at Harlem's streets, watching people walk past, watching cars drive by, watching the neighborhood settle into the evening. This was his hunting ground now. Somewhere out there, Bumpy Johnson was going about his business, completely unaware that a Chicago killer had arrived with a contract and a plan and $10,000 worth of motivation to put a bullet in his head. Corrigan smiled. Johnson had 2 weeks to live. Maybe less if Corrigan worked quickly. Maybe just 6 days if the Saturday barbershop hit went smoothly. Johnson didn't know it yet, but he was already dead. He just hadn't stopped breathing yet. That's what Corrigan thought. That's what Corrigan believed with absolute certainty as he stood in that hotel room, looking out at Harlem, planning his approach. What Corrigan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know because he was an outsider who didn't understand how Harlem worked, was that at that exact moment, while he was standing at his window feeling confident and professional and in control, 3 different people on the street below were looking up at his window, watching him, noting which room he was in, observing that he'd arrived with luggage but no family, that he'd paid cash, that he'd chosen a hotel on the edge of Harlem rather than staying in Midtown Manhattan like most white visitors. And those 3 watchers were already making phone calls. Already passing information up a chain of communication that led directly to Bumpy Johnson. Already setting in motion a response that would turn Corrigan from hunter into prey before he even realized the game had changed. But Corrigan didn't know that yet. So he spent Tuesday night cleaning his weapons and studying Johnson's file and planning his approach, completely unaware that his target already knew his name, knew he'd arrived, knew which hotel room he was staying in, and was making plans of his own. Wednesday morning, 8 a.m. Corrigan left his hotel to begin surveillance. He dressed like a businessman, carried a newspaper and a camera, and looked like every other white man who occasionally had business in Harlem. He walked past Johnson's apartment building on West 139th Street. Noted the entrance, the fire escapes, the sightlines, counted windows and estimated which apartment was Johnson's based on the building's layout. He sat in a diner across the street for 2 hours, drinking coffee, watching the building, writing notes about who came and went. He saw 2 men who looked like bodyguards leave the building at 9:30 a.m., saw them return 20 minutes later with food, saw other people come and go, residents and visitors, the normal flow of apartment life. At 11 a.m., Corrigan walked to the first policy bank on his list. He didn't go inside, just observed from across the street, watching people enter and exit, trying to identify Johnson or his key associates. The bank was busy, people coming and going constantly, placing bets, collecting winnings, and conducting the business that made Johnson wealthy and powerful. Corrigan took photographs from a distance, trying to capture faces he could study later. He spent Wednesday documenting everything, building a mental map of Johnson's operation, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities. By Wednesday evening, Corrigan was confident he understood the basic structure of Johnson's world. But something bothered him. Nothing he could identify specifically, just a feeling that something was slightly wrong. He noticed the shoeshine boy outside his hotel seemed to be there every time Corrigan left or returned. Noticed the woman selling newspapers on the corner made eye contact just a fraction too long when he walked past. Noticed the bartender at the club where he had drinks Wednesday night seemed overly attentive, refilling his glass before he asked, watching him more carefully than bartenders usually watched customers. Corrigan had been doing this work for 11 years. He'd developed instincts about surveillance, about when he was being watched, about when something felt wrong even if he couldn't prove it. And his instincts were screaming now that something wasn't right. But he couldn't identify what. The watchers, if they were watchers, were too subtle, too good, too careful to do anything obvious that would confirm his suspicions. Thursday, Corrigan changed his approach. Instead of following a predictable pattern, he varied his routine, left the hotel at different times, took different routes, doubled back suddenly to see if anyone was following, and that's when he saw them. Not obviously, not clumsily, but saw them nonetheless. A man in a brown coat who turned away just a fraction too quickly when Corrigan doubled back. A woman with a shopping bag who appeared near Johnson's apartment when Corrigan was there, then appeared again near the policy bank 2 hours later, which was a possible coincidence, but felt like a pattern. A car that drove past his hotel 3 times Thursday afternoon, different drivers each time, but the same car, same license plate, same careful attention to the hotel entrance. Corrigan was being watched. That much was clear now. But by whom? Johnson's people seemed most likely. But how would they know to watch him? He'd been careful. Hadn't told anyone in New York why he was here. Hadn't made contact with any local criminals who might report to Johnson. Hadn't done anything that would identify him as a threat, rather than just another white man visiting Harlem. Unless Schultz's organization leaked. Unless someone in Schultz's crew told Johnson about the contract. Certain unless Johnson knew Corrigan was coming before Corrigan even arrived in New York. That thought terrified Corrigan in a way few things did, because if Johnson knew, if Johnson had known from the beginning, then everything Corrigan had done for the past 2 days wasn't surveillance. It was a performance. It was Corrigan being allowed to scout and plan and prepare. Being watched every moment, being studied like Corrigan was the target and Johnson was the hunter, and the entire situation was reversed from what Corrigan believed. Thursday night, Corrigan sat in his hotel room with his .38 revolver on the table, trying to decide what to do. The professional move was to abort. Return the money. Tell Schultz the contract was compromised. Walk away and live to take another job. But $10,000. See, that was more money than Corrigan had ever been paid for a single hit. That was enough money to change his life, to retire if he wanted, to set himself up permanently. And maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe the watchers were a coincidence. Maybe Johnson didn't know anything, and Corrigan was seeing patterns where none existed. Friday morning, Corrigan made his decision. He'd proceed with the Saturday barbershop hit. If Johnson didn't show up, if the barbershop was somehow different from the pattern Schultz had documented, then Corrigan would know the contract was compromised, and he'd abort. But if Johnson showed up like he did every Saturday, if everything proceeded normally, then Corrigan's paranoia was just paranoia, and he'd complete the hit and collect his money and leave New York before anyone understood what happened. So Saturday morning, 9:30 a.m. Corrigan positioned himself across the street from the barbershop on Lenox Avenue. The shop was exactly as Schultz had described. Single chair. One barber. No other customers this early. Johnson's preferred time. Corrigan wore a heavy coat despite the mild weather. The coat concealed his .38 revolver with its improvised silencer. The plan was simple. Wait for Johnson to arrive. Wait for him to sit in the barber's chair. Cross the street. Push past the bodyguards before they could react. Shoot Johnson twice in the head. Walk quickly, but not run to the corner. Turn left. Disappear into the Saturday morning crowd. 30 seconds total. $10,000 earned. At 9:58 a.m., a black Cadillac pulled up in front of the barbershop. Corrigan's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment. The car door opened, and 2 men got out first. Bodyguards, exactly as expected. They flanked the barbershop entrance, looked up and down the street, and checked for threats. Professional security, but not paranoid. They weren't expecting anything. Then Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the Cadillac. Tall, well-dressed, wearing an expensive gray suit and a fedora, looking exactly like his photographs. Johnson said something to one of the bodyguards, smiled, walked into the barbershop like he owned the world, and had no reason to fear anything in it. Mid-roll call to action. Before we continue, if you're wondering how this impossible situation ends, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change everything you think you know about power and fear and survival. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Corrigan waited 20 minutes. Through the barbershop window, he could see Johnson sitting in the chair, the barber working on his hair, Johnson relaxed and comfortable, like this was the safest place in the world. The bodyguards stood outside, one on each side of the door, watching the street but not watching carefully. They were bored, routine. They'd done this dozens of times, and nothing ever happened, and they didn't expect anything to happen today. Corrigan folded his newspaper, put his hand inside his coat, and felt the grip of the .38 revolver. He started crossing the street, walking steadily. Not fast, not slow. Just another man crossing the street on a Saturday morning. 10 steps from the barbershop. The bodyguards still hadn't noticed him. They were talking to each other, not paying attention. 7 steps. Corrigan's hand tightened on the revolver. 5 steps. He was going to make it. Going to get close enough to push through before they can stop him. Going to complete this hit and collect his money and prove that his paranoia had been wrong. And 3 steps from the barbershop entrance, A hand grabbed his elbow. Corrigan spun. A colored man in an expensive suit was standing next to him, smiling like they were old friends. Behind the man, Corrigan saw 4 other men converging from different directions, all colored, all well-dressed, all moving with purpose. The man holding Corrigan's elbow spoke quietly. "Mickey Corrigan, you're a long way from Chicago. Why don't we take a walk?" Corrigan reached for his revolver, but the man's grip tightened like a vice. "I wouldn't do that, Mickey. There are 8 of us on this street right now. You might shoot me, might shoot one other person if you're fast. Then you'd die right here on this sidewalk in front of all these witnesses. Or you come with us peacefully, have a conversation, and maybe you live through today. Your choice. 3 seconds." Corrigan looked around. The 4 men were close now, surrounding him, hands in their pockets in ways that suggested weapons. The bodyguards outside the barbershop were watching now, hands inside their coats, ready to draw guns if Corrigan made a wrong move. Inside the barbershop, visible through the window, Bumpy Johnson was still sitting in the barber's chair. But he wasn't looking at the mirror anymore. He was looking directly at Corrigan through the window, making eye contact. And Johnson was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not a mocking smile, just a calm, knowing smile that said, "Hi, I knew you were coming. I've been waiting, and now you're mine." Corrigan understood everything in that moment. Understood that Johnson had known about the contract from the beginning. Understood that the past 4 days hadn't been surveillance, had been theater, had been Corrigan being allowed to scout and plan while Johnson watched and waited and prepared. Understood that the Saturday morning barbershop visit wasn't routine, wasn't a coincidence. Johnson had come here specifically because he knew Corrigan would be here. Had used himself as bait in a trap that Corrigan had walked into like an amateur. Corrigan released his grip on the revolver, took his hand out of his coat, showed his palms, the universal gesture of surrender. "I'll come peacefully," Corrigan said. The man holding his elbow smiled wider. "Smart choice, Mickey. Very smart choice." They walked him to a car parked around the corner, put him in the back seat between 2 large men who made sure Corrigan understood that any sudden movement would be his last. They drove through Harlem, took turns that Corrigan didn't track, and ended up at a building Corrigan didn't recognize. They walked him inside, downstairs into a basement, and sat him in a chair in the middle of an empty room. They didn't tie him up. Didn't need to. With 8 men watching him, Corrigan wasn't going anywhere. Then they left him alone. For 2 hours, Corrigan sat in that chair, staring at blank walls, listening to footsteps above him, wondering if he was going to die in this basement, wondering if he should have aborted the contract when his instincts screamed that something was wrong. Wondering if $10,000 was worth dying for. At 12:47 p.m., the door opened. Bumpy Johnson walked into the basement, carrying 2 cups of coffee, looking like he was visiting a friend rather than confronting the man sent to kill him. Johnson handed 1 coffee to Corrigan, sat down in a chair facing him, studied Corrigan for a long moment without speaking. Finally, Johnson broke the silence. "Dutch Schultz sent you. Paid you $5,000 up front. Promised $5,000 more when I'm dead. Wanted it done within 2 weeks. Wanted it clean, professional. No connection back to him. Am I missing anything?" Corrigan said nothing. There was nothing to say. Johnson obviously knew everything. Johnson continued. "We knew you were coming before you left Chicago. We knew which train you'd take. We knew which hotel you'd pick. See, we've been watching you since the moment you arrived. Every move you made, every photograph you took, every time you walked past my apartment or my policy banks. We were watching. Did you really think you could walk into Harlem and kill me without anyone noticing?" Corrigan found his voice. "How did you know?" "I didn't tell anyone. Schultz didn't tell anyone except whoever set up the wire transfer. There's no way you could have known." Johnson smiled. Schultz has people in his organization who are more loyal to money than they are to him. One of them called me 6 hours after Schultz called you. Told me everything. The contract, the amount, your name, your reputation, your methods. I've known about you longer than you've known about me, Mickey. And that meant I could control everything that happened from the moment you arrived. I let you scout, let you plan, let you think you understood how this would work. Then I used myself as bait and watched you walk right into the trap. Corrigan felt sick. He'd been played, completely, professionally, perfectly. So now you kill me, Corrigan said. That's how this ends. I tried to kill you. I failed. You killed me. That's fair. That's how this world works. Johnson took a sip of his coffee. Maybe. Maybe not. That depends on you, Mickey. See, I don't particularly want to kill you. You're a professional. You took a contract. You tried to complete it. That's not personal. That's business. You're not my enemy. Dutch Schultz is my enemy. You're just a tool he tried to use. And I don't kill tools. I turn them against the people who tried to use them. Corrigan stared at Johnson, not understanding. Johnson leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen, Mickey. You're going to stay in Harlem for a while, as my guest. Comfortable room, good food, anything you need except freedom to leave. You're going to stay here for maybe 2 months, maybe 3. Long enough that Dutch Schultz believes you're dead. Long enough that the entire underworld hears the story. Dutch Schultz sent a contract killer after Bumpy Johnson, and the killer vanished. Just disappeared. Nobody knows if Johnson killed him, turned him, or scared him so badly that he ran away to another country. The uncertainty is the point, Mickey. The fear is the point. Let them wonder what happened to you. Let them imagine all the terrible things I might have done. That fear will hurt Schultz more than your death would. And what about me? Corrigan asked. What happens when you're done using me to scare Schultz? You kill me then? Johnson shook his head. Then you leave New York. Take your $5,000 and go somewhere far away and retire from contract killing. Go to California. Go to Mexico. Go anywhere you want as long as it's not Chicago and it's not New York. Start a new life. Open a restaurant. Buy a farm. Do whatever people do when they stop killing for money. You get to live, Mickey, which is more than you'd get if I handed you back to Schultz after you failed to kill me. Schultz would torture you for information, then kill you. I'm offering you survival. The only price is that you can never work in New York again, and you have to let me take one photograph. Johnson pulled out a camera. Smile, Mickey. This photograph is going to destroy Dutch Schultz more effectively than a bullet ever could. Corrigan understood. Johnson was going to send Schultz proof that Corrigan was alive, was comfortable, was drinking whiskey with the man he'd been sent to kill, was going to make it look like Corrigan had been turned, had been bought, had become Johnson's ally instead of Schultz's weapon. That photograph would destroy Schultz's reputation more thoroughly than killing Corrigan would, because it would prove that Johnson didn't need to kill people who came after him. Johnson was so dangerous, so smart, so far ahead of everyone else, that he could turn assassins into allies, could convert threats into propaganda, could win without fighting, because the fight was over before his enemies realized it had begun. Corrigan smiled for the photograph. Not because he wanted to, because he understood he had no choice. Because Johnson's offer was genuine and generous, the only reason Corrigan was still alive. Johnson took the photograph, had it developed immediately, showed it to Corrigan. In the photograph, Corrigan was sitting in a comfortable leather chair, holding a glass of expensive whiskey, smiling at the camera like he was at a party. Behind him, visible in the frame, were 2 of Johnson's men, also smiling, also relaxed. The photograph looked like friends celebrating together. Looked like Corrigan had been welcomed into Johnson's organization. Looked like exactly the kind of betrayal that would destroy any trust Schultz had in his remaining associates. Johnson packaged the photograph carefully, included Corrigan's identification papers, included the .38 revolver with Schultz's serial number still visible on the frame, included $5,000 in cash, the exact amount Schultz had paid up front, and included a note, handwritten in Johnson's careful script. Your man decided to retire. He's staying in Harlem as my guest for a while to make sure he doesn't have any relapses in judgment. He asked me to refund your deposit. You want him back? Come get him yourself. I'll be waiting. The package arrived at Schultz's headquarters 2 days later. Monday morning, January 27, 1936. Schultz opened the package in his office, with 3 of his top associates watching. He pulled out the photograph first, stared at it for a long moment. His face went white, then red, then white again. He threw the photograph across the room, pulled out the identification papers. The gun, the money, read the note. And then Dutch Schultz did something his associates had never seen him do in 20 years of working together. He sat down at his desk and put his head in his hands, and was silent for 5 full minutes. When he finally looked up, Schultz's face was different. Older, tired, defeated. He turned him, Schultz said quietly. Johnson turned my killer, or killed him and staged the photograph, or scared him so badly that Corrigan begged for his life, and Johnson took the photograph before killing him. I don't know which. And that's the point. Johnson wants me to wonder, wants me to imagine what happened, wants me to understand that he's so far ahead of me that he knew Corrigan was coming and set a trap and caught him like a rabbit. And he wants me to know that if I send someone else, the same thing will happen. And if I come after Johnson myself, I'll end up in a photograph too. One of Schultz's associates tried to argue. Boss, maybe Corrigan just failed. Maybe we should send someone better, someone Johnson doesn't know about, someone who can actually finish the job. We can't let this stand. We can't let Johnson beat us again. Schultz looked at the man like he was speaking a foreign language. It's over. Don't you understand that? Johnson didn't just beat Corrigan. He beat me, beat my reputation, beat any chance I had of controlling Harlem or maintaining respect in New York. Other gangsters are going to hear about this. They're going to hear that I sent my best killer, and Johnson made him vanish. They're going to see this photograph and wonder if Corrigan really was turned. And even if they don't believe that, they're going to know that Johnson is smart enough and dangerous enough to catch professional killers and turn them into propaganda. Nobody is going to fear me after this. Nobody is going to respect me. I'm finished. Schultz was right. The story spread through New York's underworld within 48 hours. Dutch Schultz sent a contract killer after Bumpy Johnson. The killer vanished. Johnson sent back a photograph and a note and the money Schultz had paid. The details got embellished with each telling. Some versions said Corrigan was definitely alive, working for Johnson now, had given up all of Schultz's secrets. Other versions said Johnson killed Corrigan slowly over 3 days, took the photograph to fake Corrigan's defection, then dumped the body where it would never be found. A few versions, the ones that scared people most, said Johnson turned Corrigan without torture, without bribes, just through conversation, through explaining how futile it was to work against Johnson, through making Corrigan understand that Johnson was inevitable and unstoppable, and that working for Schultz meant dying while working for Johnson meant thriving. Nobody knew which version was true. That was Johnson's genius. The uncertainty was more powerful than any single truth would have been. Within a month, 2 of Schultz's key associates left his organization. Within 6 weeks, Schultz's remaining Harlem operations shut down completely. Within 3 months, other gangsters who'd once treated Schultz as an equal were excluding him from meetings, cutting him out of deals, treating him like he was irrelevant. And in October 1936, 9 months after the photograph arrived, Dutch Schultz was shot to death in a Newark restaurant by assassins sent by the Commission, the board of organized crime bosses who'd decided Schultz had become too unstable, too reckless, too damaged to be trusted anymore. They killed Schultz for a lot of reasons, but everyone in New York's underworld knew that one of those reasons, maybe the biggest reason, was that Bumpy Johnson had destroyed Schultz's reputation so thoroughly that Schultz stopped being valuable and became a liability. Johnson killed Schultz without firing a single shot. Killed him with a photograph and a note and the complete psychological dismantling of everything Schultz believed about power and respect and control. And Mickey Corrigan? He left New York in April 1936, 2 months after the photograph was taken. Johnson gave him $10,000, the full contract amount, and a train ticket to Los Angeles. Told him to start over. Told him never to work as a contract killer again. Told him that if Johnson ever heard Corrigan's name associated with a murder anywhere in America, Johnson would find him and the mercy he'd shown in New York would not be repeated. Corrigan took the money and the ticket and the warning. He opened a restaurant in Santa Monica, served good food to movie people and tourists, never told anyone about his past. Never touched a gun again. Lived quietly until he died of a heart attack in 1963. 27 years after the day he tried to kill Bumpy Johnson and learned that some men are not meant to be killed, are instead meant to teach everyone else what power really means. The lesson stuck. For the next 30 years, until Johnson died in 1968, no other contract killer ever accepted a job to assassinate Bumpy Johnson. The Corrigan story became legend, became the cautionary tale that older gangsters told younger ones, became the proof that Johnson wasn't just another criminal who got lucky, but was instead something more dangerous, something more intelligent, something that operated on a level most gangsters couldn't even comprehend. You don't hunt Bumpy Johnson. You don't bet against Bumpy Johnson. You don't send killers after Bumpy Johnson. Because Johnson sees everything, knows everything, controls everything. And the only way to survive in Johnson's world is to understand that he's always 3 moves ahead, always anticipating, always turning your attack into your own destruction. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson too late. Mickey Corrigan learned it just in time. And everyone else in New York's underworld learned it by watching what happened to the men who didn't learn fast enough.